Because we're not going to run out of time, but I want to ask about Isak. More reports today, Toon Tactics, that Isak could be sold by yourselves. Arsenal were a club that want him. Do you see that happening in January or in the summer, or do you think Isak will stay at Newcastle? What's your take, bro?
I'll be aware of my own biases. I'll first say it will stay at Newcastle. In terms of the sources, I think but obviously it's trying to speak objectively. Arsenal are a big club. It's not. Liverpool had to sell Coutinho, Man United had to sell Ronaldo. People sell players all the time. In terms of the sources, my understanding of it was this all sprung from the whole Gordon deal. Gordon got a deal, and then the natural order of things, there was a journalist that said, okay, Newcastle aren't kind of going to be talking to Isak just yet, but there is some murmurings of what that they might talk about a new contract, but they're not in a push to do it because he's still got 3 or 4 years left. From that, his camp then spoke to another journalist called Craig Hope at Newcastle and said, well, we're not speaking to Newcastle because we don't know if we're going to get Champions League. And then that's when the whole situation with kind of Arsenal kind of began to kind of grow as well. That's not to say that this isn't happening, but this is just my interpretation of kind of seeing journalists coming along. In terms of January, I don't see it happen. If these things were serious and it was concrete, I don't see it happening in January unless Arsenal had. I think even if Arsenal, if you're looking at January, you're looking at to make Newcastle to pick up the phone, you're looking at 130, 140 million plus in January. And I don't think anyone wants to do that kind of outlay in January. And I think I'll be more worried if it was Chelsea than if it was Arsenal, because I think Chelsea have more things to bargain with in terms of player plus cash deals, first choice and maybe academy players and stuff like that. But if Arsenal really wanted Isak, it wouldn't be in January. If they wanted to get a good run up on him, it'll probably be in the summer. But again, it would have to be an offer that Newcastle would force Newcastle to sit down, and then they'd have to hope that, I don't know, Chelsea, Man United, Bayern Munich, whoever don't also come in with a similar offer for him as well, like a Declan Rice sort of situation. But I think, and I'd like to think, and again, my own biases, I think hopefully the more likely outcome is that Isak renews his contract in the summer and continues to play for Newcastle, as did Anthony Gordon, Bruno Gyokeres, Joe Linton, and others.
I still don't think personally that Isak is the right striker for Arsenal. I think they've got to get Gyokeres. I think Isak is a top striker, but I think Gyokeres has just got something that he kind of gives me like a little bit of the Haaland vibe, where he could just come in and score 30 league goals. And I think Toon Tactics, what is his, like, how is his injury record as bad as some people say, or do you think that's just over exaggerated with his?
They could just look up on FotMob or SofaScore. I think last season he was out for about 6 weeks to a month, to 2 months maybe, but then he played the rest of the time. And that's mainly because we can't rotate with Callum Wilson and others, and we had Champions League and it was horrific last season. This season he's only been out for about 3 or 4 weeks, and that's because of a toe injury or whatnot. But otherwise, it's been fit and firing. I think people are overplaying it. I think I'll be more careful. Maybe I lean heavily towards Premier League proven players. It's not to say that Gyokeres can't make it, but Portuguese league is, if you look at Opta stats, for instance, it's like the 5th, 6th league. I mean, and I think he has a lot to prove. Say that again?
His record in the Europa League and the Champions League is still like very, very good. He's already got, I think he's got 5 goals in 4 games this season in the Champions League. And actually, I think soon as well. So like, I think it's in Portugal. If Gyokeres could bag a couple of goals there, like I know the League of Portugal, Liga NOS, whatever you want to call it, like you said, that the league standard is nowhere near. And like Jacob said in the chat, Darwin Núñez come over, his numbers were good. But the fact that he has done it both in the Europa League and in the Champions League, and he already destroyed City this season, I just think he's apparently available for like £60 million as well. Newcastle have got every right to hold out for north of 100 mil as it stands right now. They've got to be looking at that. I think, well, hang on. If we
what you described are cup competitions, Europa League by its standard. I mean, the teams that are there I mean, some of them won't make it in the top half of the Premier League. And you know, a lot of teams can beat Man City on a one-off game and stuff like that. And it's not to belittle or to make it smaller, but I think you need the larger. If you're comparing not just Isak and Gyokeres, but any player that's already playing in the league, Ollie Watkins compared to somebody else outside the league, and you're looking for a top striker, you're going to lean towards the one that's actually done it in the league and played day in, day out, played against your Brentfords, played against Fulham away and stuff like that. You don't know if Gyokeres can do that. There's a reason why Brighton didn't, who he was at earlier, didn't really push the button on him and keep him, and sold him to the Portuguese in the league in the first place. Coventry didn't really keep him. They sold him on as well. It's not to say that he hasn't grown, he hasn't developed. And maybe he's found his league. Maybe Portugal is his style and it's his league. Like Enzo Fernandez, for instance.
Wait, but I think from like a business standpoint, it makes more sense to go get Gyokeres, who Henry said he does have a release clause that's significantly lower than what you have to pay for Isak to get him from Newcastle. So now if you're Arsenal, you can go sign Gyokeres for maybe like 70 million, and then you could use maybe like another 30-40 million to go get another player versus having to use 130 million to go get Isak from a Newcastle who does have his injury problems, and maybe he can't play in a possession-based style of football in that U shape. He probably needs to be more in transition, etc. So I just think it makes sense.
Callum, can I ask you a question? As an Arsenal fan, of the two, they seem to be the two strikers you're linked to the most. Which of the two would you prefer and or think's more plausible of getting?
Do you know what? I think it's hard, and I think all of you make great points, and I think ultimately it's going to come down to where Arsenal are in January or in the summer. I think if we're in and around it by January, I do think we will try and get someone in, and I do think we will buy someone, and I think Gyokeres is probably the more likely one at that period of time because of the buyout clause, and I think it's more likely that he will come from Portugal to England and wanting to do that and wanting to come to the big boy league. I think Isak is unlikely in January because, as you just said, I think the money will be ridiculous. And again, I think that would knock Newcastle's aims and ambitions going forward because ultimately, they are a big club and they want to compete with the biggest clubs. And I think that would knock them and almost ruin their season depending on where they are as well. So I think, if we're in and around it in January, we'll go for the we're poaching from Portugal, and like I say, if it goes down to the summer, it'll be Isak. That's what I personally think. I think it all depends on where we are in the race and Champions League to what we do, and if we hold out to the summer or not.
Also depends on Newcastle. If Newcastle get Europa League, or which I think they could because they've only got one game a week. That point, I don't think
we're taking your spot. We're going Champions League, mate.
I think it's more about Isak than it is either two. And I mean this in this regard. If Isak really wants Arsenal, I think we still live in an era where it happens, and that's because most clubs recognise you don't want to keep a player that doesn't want to be at your club. Even Pep and these guys, whether they've done it with Leroy Sane and others, when the player don't want to be there, they find an alternative. And I do mean this with all due respect to Newcastle. If they were going head-to-head along with, say, City and Arsenal for winning Premier Leagues, etc., then I think Newcastle would find an alternative. But I still think with where you are, if Isak sits down with you all and says, look, guys, I really want to go, I think if the money's right, he may end up going in that regard. Newcastle won't want him to go, but if the player's forcing it and pushing it and asking, I think it could happen.
I don't think that he could say please though, Terry. I think he has to force the move.
Yeah, but maybe. But typically speaking,
he got to turn off his phone, not go to training.
No, maybe he has to do that. But I actually think most clubs again that are well run, and Newcastle are well run now. When a player behaves in the right way and asks to leave and explains why, as long as they get the right money. Typically speaking, they're okay with doing it because, especially if you bring in 120 odd million pound, maybe Newcastle go and buy Victor Gyokeres as an example, and he comes in and does equally as well. Plus, they've made a profit, and I think Newcastle will already be planning because most well-run clubs do. But what do we do if Isak leaves? Who's the alternative? They might look at it and say we love him, but actually we think that Gyokeres, or we think that I'm making it up now, but like an Evan Ferguson. We think an Evan Ferguson and spending the remaining £70 million on a new creative midfield player, that elevates us to an even higher level. And I think that Newcastle will be planning for that eventuality.
But then what does that say about Newcastle? And I guess maybe Toon Tigers could answer, because when they got those owners, right? Mm-hmm. Like because then if you sell him to a direct Premier League club that's competing for the league, mm-hmm. I feel like that kind of sets like a bad precedent, because then it's like, all right, then what are the expectations for Newcastle then? Because when they got, was it the Saudis, the Qataris, was one of them, right? Newcastle fans are talking about signing all the best players in the world and competing for the Premier League and competing in all these. So if you now sell Isak to Arsenal, I now feel like, well, now if you're Bruno Guimaraes, or if you're Sandro Tonali, or just like Lewis Hall, whoever, you're sitting there like, well, they're clearly not serious about competing. So like, why should I stay here? And the next thing you know, they might be looking to leave the club as well. And then now Newcastle just finds themselves in a predicament where they're just a rich Brighton, where it's like, okay, they'll just sell their best players and they'll buy talent and then they'll sell them. So I feel like that's kind of a bad look optically for Newcastle to be selling their best players to direct Premier League clubs.
No, yeah, I think you make a good point. I think it matters how it happens. So if the scenario is Isak forces a move in January and we cave in, then it looks bad. But you have to also remember the reality of the situation is Gordon, who's got very similar to GA to Isak last year, just signed a new contract. Bruno Gyokeres, who's actually our top player, also signed a new contract. So there's a lot of blue chip players who are with us already staying. So they're already there. And so the owners are showing and directors are showing that there is a whole load of ambition there. So if Isak really, in terms of Isak, again, heavy bias, I do think he wants to stay. But should he want to leave and he get sold in the summer, in terms of look, I think what happens is then if you're a player, if you're Bruno, if you're other players and you're seeing Isak go, the next thing you're looking for is who do Newcastle bring in then? If Newcastle don't bring in anybody of note, for instance, and like what Terry was saying, if you bring in the Victor Gyokeres or somebody I personally wouldn't want Victor Gyokeres, but somebody of good standing, for instance, then it's, we'll keep it going. And in terms of Brighton, I wouldn't belittle Brighton. And we talked about structure. They've had their scouting, their recruitment, their directors, everything, managers ripped out of them consistently through the years. But they've maintained the structure and are competitive. And I think are only 3 points maybe behind Arsenal at the moment. So I think it shows as if there's more ways than one to kind of climb up the Premier League and win trophies nowadays. So I'm personally, as a fan, watching and kind of seeing the structure of my club and seeing the owners, seeing Paul Mitchell, who's very, very renowned of his track record in the recruitment. I'm not overly worried. Do I want Isak to stay? Obviously. But that's where the owners and the sporting director's job is, that if an Isak should leave, that they show the players real ambition and bring in the right level of talent into Newcastle.
I think real quick, bro. Real quick. So I wasn't trying to disrespect Brighton when I brought up just being like a rich Brighton. I don't necessarily rate them.
You weren't bigging them up.
No. But the reason why I brought them up is because when you guys got taken over, the expectations were not to just be.
No, that was the expectation from the people looking in. If you read any of our journals or anything, articles, the owners are consistently telling people there's PSR, there's PSR, there's PSR. Yes, we are the richest owners and we can buy most of your clubs 20 times over. However, we can't do that in the Premier League because of PSR. And that has always been the story.
So why they so then they just bought Newcastle to just have a team in the Prem?
They said at the beginning, Will, that this was a kind of 10-year project because clubs can't do now what Chelsea were able to do when Roman came in for the first 10 years of his ownership, where you could spend unlimited. I think City had 3 to 4 seasons where they could spend an unlimited amount of money. Real Madrid, the club you picked to support, they went through, before FFP existed, they would run up huge debts and then the Spanish government would just pay this stuff off, right? So a lot of other clubs had an advantage that there weren't checks and balances in place. So I think it's how Newcastle do it. If they sell Isak to a Premier League rival for 120 million, and then they invest that money in 2 players that make them better as a club, I don't think Bruno Guimaraes and Tonali are going to say, well, fuck this, I'm leaving. Yeah. If they take that money and then go and buy some 18-year-old wonder kid who's not proven, who ends up flopping, or they pocketed the money like some owners do, like the Glazers at my club, then I think those other players will go, bloody hell, where's the ambition? But I think there is an understanding that Newcastle were never going to be able to. Again, everybody started panicking when they took over. I remember sitting there watching, thinking, but the PSR and FFP dictate they can't spend whatever they want. And maybe they'll be able to increase the spending if the associated party transaction rules are slightly softened, and they'll be able to increase. But even then, they're not going to be able to sponsor their grass for £1 billion a season. Everyone thinks they're going to do something mad. You're probably talking about an extra 50 to £100 million a year income, which is significant, but it doesn't mean you can go out and sign 4 world-class players.